I am interested in science in its history, and I am particularly interested in a moment in which science started to resemble what it is today, but it wasn't quite what it is today. Not so much because people knew less about nature than the contemporary world, but because the organization of knowledge was completely different from what it is today. And so some boundaries that are in place were not in place at the time. For example, science and art seem to be so different and separated in our world, but in the time period I study, they overlapped and indeed helped each other, and in many cases that we will work on and think about, they were indistinguishable. I'm very interested in thinking about science not so much as a set of theories and discoveries, but more about science, more of science as labor, as work, not only intellectual, but also manual. And so in my work, I foreground categories of people that are usually left aside in mainstream histories of science. I'm interested in craftspeople, artisans, and their role in the production of knowledge about nature, not as collaborators, but actually as main figures in these histories. Artists were, in the time period I work on, artisans, in fact. Michelangelo, my time period is the time period of great artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo and others, except they did not think of themselves as artists, they were artisans. And they had a lot to say about nature. So in the seminar, I am thinking about, and I will finalize with those of you who will take the course, I would like to think about techniques to make visible the invisible, what nature doesn't reveal itself, but that through instruments like the microscope, the telescope, the surgical tools came to be seen for the first time by humans. And so I want to give you a sense of what I am talking about. Let's go back to the questions later. The first time that a telescope was pointed to the sky was around the beginning of the 17th century. And one of the most celebrated discoveries of the time is that the moon that appeared as very spherical and perfect and glass-like was not so perfect, but it resembled the Earth more than people from antiquity up to the 17th century used to think. Now, this can appear like a self-evident truth. In fact, if you look through a Galileo's telescope, and I do own a replica that I will bring to our class, and if we are lucky with the weather, we can actually appreciate this that I'm saying a little bit better. When you look at the moon through a Galileo telescope, what you see is not so obvious to your brain. And so how did Galileo come up with this kind of image that we see here? The answer that we'll explore and unpack is that he was trained as a draftsman. And so he knew how to interpret visually shadows and lights that appeared through the telescope. And so he could come up with this kind of image, which is not a realistic image of the moon, but it gives a sense of what this celestial body may look like in reality, thanks to his training in the crafts of the time. So we will explore a number of famous cases. I want to give you a flavor of another different one, from the cosmos to the smallest world. This is a magnified flea. The first time humans realized that insects as insignificant, that they thought of as insignificant as fleas, were in fact very complex. And this is the first very famous illustration of this insect. And what stunned observers at the time was the fact that you can find such complexity in something that the human eye cannot appreciate. And so that opened up a number of questions that were really at the intersection of theology, religion, and science. I don't know how, I don't want to talk too much, and I haven't timed myself, but I hope this gives you a flavor. I do have another beautiful illustration that I'd like to share today, because we see a woman that probably many of you have not heard about, even though in her own time she was very famous. This is the naturalist Maria Sibylla Merian, German, who traveled to Suriname and produced an atlas of insects. And the way she represented the insects that she saw in Suriname with the help of indigenous people and enslaved people is very unique in her own time, because it represents an ecosystem in which the insect is represented along with parasites, with the flower or fruit on which they feed, and also the various life stage, what we call life stages, represented in here. Sometimes we have predators. So there are also some arguments about the nature of nature that we find in illustrations of natural history. So Yale has amazing resources for this kind of work, in that the collections here are very rich. And what I'd like to do in the class is to take you to the places where these primary sources, where these materials are kept, and so that you can work hands-on to the extent that it is possible on these illustrations. We'll think about how coloring is actually a technique that is deeply involved with science, because of course, when you print the book that Maria Maria published, you have black and white engravings, and so coloring is not standardized, and there is great variety in the kind of colors that you see in these books all over the world. I also like to work on scientific instruments, and as you heard, I am the curator of the collection of scientific instruments that is kept at the Peabody Museum, so I count on using at least part of this in this seminar. And so the kind of questions we will be asking and thinking about, not always being able to answer them, have to do with the trustworthiness of images. When do we trust an image versus when do we think, and why, that an image doesn't quite represent the natural object that it purposed to represent? And when does a picture clarify rather than mislead? And in the case, I think this is very current. So these older cases actually help us, equip us with asking questions that are relevant to the present world. When students see an illustration, an image, or even a photograph, how do they learn to interpret it? How do they read it? Rather than just admiring it. And of course, the main question will be, do we draw the line between science and art? What expenses? And what happens if we don't? I'm very much looking forward to your questions later, and to finalizing the seminar with you. Thank you.